Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang, and the Good Faith Podcast is where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. And we have our founding friend, David French, coming back here on the Good Faith Podcast. First, before I set the stage for Kara Powell, our guest, I want to explain why the particular angle we're talking about our kids today, which is we want to focus on teen anxiety. And I've been doing a lot of work, as you know, David, on anxiety among adults. It's something that I think is hugely important as well. And it's probably related to the teen anxiety issue, although I think it's a distinct issue. My angle has been that I'm twofold. One, as somebody who has suffered from anxiety myself, and listeners of the podcast know I've told a story about how 15 years ago, anxiety was to some extent responsible for my end of my career as a pastor. I've been reflecting a long time on the spiritual meaning of anxiety, and with the perspective that I think as a church, we have not helpfully equipped our people to deal with anxiety, that we have tended to either over spiritualize it in the sense of almost calling it either a sin or a character flaw or something that spiritually we can just pray away, like in that sense of over spiritualizing, or we've under spiritualized it in the sense that we've just outsourced it to secular mental health and just say medication, cognitive behavioral therapy, and it has no spiritual implication. Yeah. And I think that, actually, if you look at scripture, and people's experiences, anxiety is actually an opportunity for spiritual growth. And for folks who are interested in that perspective, we've got great resources we'll put on in the show notes from some work that we've done Redeeming Babel. The rise in teen anxiety, I think, is related, but it is also its own distinct phenomenon. And that's why we very much wanted to get an expert to come on teen anxiety, and I could think of no better person than Kara Powell. So Kara Powell is the Chief of Leadership Formation at Fuller, and she's the executive director of Fuller Youth Institute, which is, I'm a senior fellow at Fuller, and I would say one of the things I'm most proud of Fuller, I think, of many things, is the Fuller Youth Institute. I think it's an amazing, incredibly important institute that's been guiding the evangelical church in youth ministry for a number of years. If you've ever heard of Sticky Faith, their list of resources all along that have been very influential in my own church and in many churches I know. Kara's kind of the force behind a lot of that. So, Kara, welcome to Good Faith Podcast, and we're so glad you're here.
Oh, it's a pleasure and honor to be with you, and I can tell just from these introductory comments, we're going to have a great conversation, Curtis and David.
Well, Kara, let's just start us out with just give us a sketch of how much of a problem, of an issue, teen anxiety is in society and in the church. How bad is it out there? Because anecdotally, it feels really, really bad.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I'll say I'm much more familiar with the U.S. data than I am data outside of the U.S. But overall, during the pandemic, anxiety tripled and depression quadrupled across generations, according to CDC data. And keep in mind, when the pandemic started, let's just say early 2020, we were already seeing an increase of stress and anxiety and depression, suicidal questions and tendencies. And so I think many of us were seeing a surge in 2018, 2019. The pandemic hits in 2020 through 2021 and continues on today. And it's tripled, or anxiety has tripled, depression has quadrupled. What's interesting about young people is that they are particularly prone to experience mental health challenges. 18 to 24-year-olds, approximately half of them, 50% of them, could be diagnosed with anxiety or depression. And young females, even more particularly, are navigating mental health. CDC just came out about a month ago with data saying that young females are twice as likely as young males to be experiencing anxiety and stress. And gosh, anecdotally, that feels low. I mean, it feels like it's even more
Totally.
than two.
Yeah.
I said at the Orange Conference in front of 8,000 youth leaders, I don't know a family with teen girls that isn't navigating mental health challenges. I know they exist, but I can't name one right at this moment.
Yeah.
It's just ubiquitous with young people, especially young females. And so that's why we need to talk about it as parents, as leaders, as people in churches, and just as people who care about the good of young people.
I kind of feel like I just want you on here to give a speech,
Yeah.
like just give your presentation. But the obvious question, the next question is
Yeah.
why? And coming at it from a couple of angles, one of the things I don't know if you saw, there was this really important big Jonathan Haidt piece in the Atlantic about social media. And I think a lot of us sort of want to say, well, okay, um, is how much of this is social media versus sort of other factors that you've seen in your work? Because I know, and my anecdotal experience is very much the same as yours. Uh, I don't know. It's hard for me to find a family with young adults or teens in it where you don't have at least one kid battling anxiety in a pretty
Yeah.
profound way. So what's the why, including the social
Yeah.
media piece, as you
Yeah, absolutely, David. Well, it's different for every young person. And so, what we have is we have correlation more than we have causation at this point. We have a number of factors that we can see are related to mental health, but it's hard, if not impossible, as I understand the data, to point to a single factor that is the primary cause for all people. But let's start with technology. Technology certainly would be on one of the top 3, 4, 5 correlates with mental health challenges. What's interesting is right about when smartphones became more common in our culture, especially among young people, there's some good news, and that is that many risk behaviors decreased. Drinking, sexual intercourse, pre-marriage, drug use, those have all slightly decreased, whereas it's mental health risk behaviors that have increased. So, you can translate that to the risk behaviors that a young person did with others are the ones that have declined. The risk behaviors that a young person generally experiences on their own in their room when they're isolated, those are the ones that are increasing. And let me just say, I graduated from high school in 1987. Woo, class of 87. But when I graduated from high school, if I wasn't invited to a party, I maybe heard about it on Monday morning. If I wasn't invited to a weekend party. Young people today, when they're not invited, they see it unfolding in real time in a device in their hand at that very moment. And so, I
Yeah.
think all that they're aware of, that they're not part of, the better life that other people seem to be having, that it's easy to see on social media. I think I would be struggling a lot more with mental health challenges if I was a teenager now than when I was a teenager. So there's a lot that's good about technology, and especially in the pandemic, 68% of young people say that technology has actually helped them feel connected to others. So there is something really good about technology,
Hmm.
and there's some pretty strong suggestions that it does lead to anxiety and stress. So technology, number one. Um, Attitudes of parents, step parents, grandparents, and the way that we've been raising our kids, we absolutely need to talk about that. We are helicopter parents who kind of swoop in and try to protect our kids from pain. And as a result, they often don't develop the muscles of resilience, or what Angela Duckworth calls grit, to really navigate these tough
Yeah.
times. And so my good friend and colleague, Scott Cormode, himself a parent of 2 young adults, says he simultaneously has 2 desires. Number 1, he wants to protect his kids from pain. Number 2, he wants them to have the kind of character and growth that usually only comes from pain. And that's exactly how I
Right.
feel as a parent, and, as others who are step parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, etc. So I think we need to hold the mirror up to ourselves and look at the ways that we have perhaps let young people's some of their emotional muscles get under nurtured. A third thing is young people's busyness. Lisa Demore, who's a fantastic psychologist, recommends that a typical young person have about 25% of their waking hours unstructured. So I think there's a busyness and a pressure. And I'll just add one last one, and that is the brain is an organ. And so just like a heart can be out of sorts and need interventions, either behavioral interventions or prescription medicine, the brain is an organ also. And so there are people who have worked so diligently and they're not using technology. They've avoided so many of the potential correlates, and yet they're still struggling. And that's because often our brain chemistry is just literally out of sorts and needs to be corrected. So those are just four. There are others.
Well, on the brain thing, the New York Times came out with this long form series on this issue, and I discovered in reading that something I had not known, but seems potentially relevant to the brain chemistry point, which is that the age of puberty has been plummeting for the last 20, 30, 40 years.
Yes.
And this article was quoting a number of neuroscience researchers that said, look, when puberty hits, that's when all the brain sort of chemistry changes rapidly. And in particular, the social brain sort of lights up, where you become very cognizant of, do you belong? And we talked about this last week about how our brains are hardwired to be very sensitive to a sense of exclusion or belonging. And that
Yeah.
you're getting a surge of those brain activity in puberty, but it's happening at a much younger age, 2 to 3 to sometimes 4 years younger than it was when we were even growing up, sometimes as young as 12, 13, when it used to be more like 16.
Yeah.
And the theory is that all of these, when you combine it with the stimulus of information about your social belonging, like that you weren't part of the party this past weekend, just young people are not equipped. They don't have the mental apparatus and the mental experience and wisdom to deal with both the flood of new information as well as their brain lighting up to be more sensitive to that. Do you think there's anything to that? Because that seems like a universal phenomenon that would explain at least some portion of why this cuts across so many different dimensions.
Yeah, well, I'm certainly not a neurologist, but I do think that I mean, you hit on some really important things, Curtis. That absolutely biologically, the age of puberty is getting younger. Young people are exposed to more and more information. I mean, the average 12-year-old knows so much about Ukraine right now. And so,
Right.
my kids know a lot of news before I do, and I stay pretty in touch with things because they're more on their phones than I am. And then if I can add a third factor, which is that often young people don't have the adult social support they need in the midst of puberty, in the midst of all that they're navigating in our culture and world. Some really important data out of Springtide Research Institute that indicates for 13 to 25-year-olds here in the US, young people
Yeah.
are open to adults like all of us, like listeners today, like viewers today, who can take that step and be a safe space through all times, including mental health challenges. So I really feel like we have a divine window as people of faith to reach out to a young person, especially a young person struggling with mental health.
So a couple of things to go back to what you were talking about earlier when you were going through the multiple factors. Two of them seemed super directed at a particular generation and culture of
Mhm.
parenting, which happens to be our generation and our culture of parenting, which is and I'm speaking of that broadly as sort of older Gen X, young baby boom, mid Gen X, which is the helicopter parenting, which is almost the exact reverse of the latchkey experience that many
Yeah.
of us had. And I was, I grew up with about the best home environment you can imagine, but I was also a latchkey kid for several years, where I let myself in and when I got home. And so very reverse from the latchkey. And then the other thing is I really want to focus for a minute on the busyness point. I can remember before my kids were in middle school, high school, um, I was a very busy person in my professional life, and I would kind of roll my eyes at my friends who didn't have the kind of job I had where I was traveling and speaking around, and when they were talking about how busy they were with their middle schooler or their high schooler. Then my kids got into middle school or high school, and I longed for the relative peace of the amount of travel I
Yeah.
was doing. Um, but I feel like we were trapped in a collective action problem, that if we wanted our daughter play volleyball, to play volleyball on the school team, that meant travel
Mhm.
volleyball. That meant And have we created kind of a juggernaut of extreme busyness and micromanaging that it's just very difficult for any individual family to hop off from without creating the anxiety of exclusion, if that makes sense?
Sure. I mean, as parents and step parents, we hate it. We hate to think that our kid is going to be behind or not have the opportunities we
Right.
want. And so we're super well intentioned. I mean, we're well intentioned here with what we're doing, but we keep them rushing from thing to thing. And then, it's interesting because we're concerned about our kids' holistic development, right? So it's not just that we want them to be really good artistically, but they also need to excel physically and mentally, et cetera. I mean, you think about it, we put expectations on 12-year-olds for all the ways they're supposed to be growing that we often don't put on ourselves as adults, like that we should be excelling in all these ways.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, absolutely. We have kids who just don't have the waking hours they need to do what they're expected to do, which then means their sleep suffers, which then also creates, more mental health challenges, more grayness, more emotional instability, et cetera, like it does for those of us over 30. So yeah, this treadmill that we adults are on, that we place our kids on, I mean, it's hurting all of us, which is where, I invite us all to think about the pandemic and talking to families with teenagers. They did like that they could have a 40-minute dinner and not a 12-minute dinner in between things. And they're having more relaxed time at home was an interesting experiment for families. And so, I appreciate thoughtful families, thoughtful churches, thoughtful organizations who are saying, how do we find healthier rhythms that are more sustainable long term? Not back to where we were in 2019, but certainly more busy than we were in 2020, 2021.
Well, let's talk about how do we navigate a way out. Clearly, no one is happy with the way things are. And so we need to start figuring out how do we get to a different place. But maybe start with at the point before we talk about like restructuring time and parenting practices. Maybe you could just start though at the point of crises. Like, let's say we have a child, a 12, 13-year-old who is feeling anxious. What are the first most important steps any parent should be doing in response?
I'm so glad you asked, Curtis. Part of what we did actually in 2019, because we already seen a surge of mental health challenges in young people, we actually spent time with a lot of mental health professionals, many of whom were Fuller Seminary alumni, and we created a 4-session podcast for parents, which I've listened to 3 times. I learn from every time that I listen to it, and that's available for free at fullyouthinstitute.org. And as I culled over the notes from those podcasts, as well as, other important principles about how to respond, I actually realized that my top 5 recommendations actually form A, B, C, D, E. Now, I'm a little, skeptical about forced acronyms.
Spoken like a true pastor. Look at
Yeah,
that. That
I know,
you've got.
I know, and a youth pastor at that. So,
Yeah.
if you take this with a grain of salt if you don't like acronyms, but I remember thinking, oh my goodness, this is like A, B, C, D, E. So I didn't even force it. I just let it emerge. And so can we walk through the A, B, C, D, E?
Please. Awesome.
Okay. So the
Yeah,
first
please.
is ask. And in one of these podcasts, one of the very practical tips we got from a therapist who specializes in adolescent anxiety. He's here in Southern California. He is my top recommendation when somebody says, I would need my child to see a therapist here in Southern California. He says he recommends that a caring adult, whether it's a teacher, pastor, mentor, parent, family member, says to a young person, ask this question. Okay, on a scale of 1 to 10, how anxious are you feeling? 10 being high. Because often kids can't verbalize feelings, and so make it as concrete as possible with numbers. And for a kid who says 1 to 3, they're doing really, really, really well. Actually, 4 or 5, probably handleable. It's 6 or above that you want to start thinking, what additional support does this young person need? So, and let me say, folks, I mean, I use this with my own kids. Hey, scale of 1 to 10, how are you feeling? I ask them this periodically, especially with mental health. And, sometimes it'll be 4, sometimes it'll be higher than that. But that's a very tangible question. And sometimes, if you're a young person, you're not even sure they know how to label it, then you can make a suggestion. If you were to rank your anxiety on a scale of 1 to 10, it feels like you're maybe about at 6. What do you think? And let them
Mm.
correct you. Young people love correcting us as adults. So, you make a suggestion and let them correct you. So that's the first one, is A. The second one is breathe. Breathe. Ask and then breathe. Breathe. If you've been around somebody who's having a panic attack, it often manifests as they have a hard time breathing. And so for us to help a young person, young people who are close to us, know how to breathe and know how to, count to 4, to take a breath, hold that breath, release for a count of 4, hold again for 4, and then do again, which is called box breathing. Or whatever breathing exercises that you can do with a young person ahead of time, so that in that moment of stress, they've practiced how to breathe. Now, I know you might think, well, we breathe all the time. Well, I've heard as an adult the importance of taking deep breaths, but it was during this research that I realized why it's so important is because I think God's given us a flight or fight reflex that when we're scared, adrenaline kicks in and our heart starts beating more strongly. That's actually a good thing for us to respond to danger. The problem is that once our heart starts beating, if it doesn't slow down, that's when there's long-term wear and tear on a body. And so what God's also given us a brake pedal, and that is filling our lungs with oxygen and breathing more slowly. That cues our heart to slow down. And so breathing is something that's really important to help a young person practice ahead of time. And again, just Google this. There are all sorts of apps that can help with this. So ask that scale of 1 to 10 question, breathe. C is center. How do we help a young person center on a helpful truth or phrase? And Curtis, I love how you said earlier in your opening comments that we often under-spiritualize or over-spiritualize anxiety. And so for those of us who are people of faith, this is our chance to really integrate our faith very overtly. And again, ahead of time, think with a young person, what is a helpful principle, a helpful word that they can reflect on. In our family, Emmanuel has been a very meaningful word since our kids were little. If they were ever concerned about something, we would talk about Emmanuel, God's with us. And so,
Mhm.
that's been meaningful for our family. Other families might choose a song lyric, a line from a poem, a scripture verse. I know one young person who when she's going into something tough, she thinks ahead of time, like, what's the worship song that I want to remember in the midst of this? And so, and I do this again with my own kids. Like, okay, we know this could be stressful. What do you want to remember? What phrase can you go back to? So that's that phrase to center on. So ask, breathe, center. Um, Fourth is develop a team. Develop a team. Life is not a solo sport. Life is a group project, and mental health is certainly a group project. And so, again, if you're a parent or a mentor in a young person's life, you're already part of that team, but who else could be part of that team? If your young person tends to be anxious in math class, then ask them, is there somebody you could reach out to who's in class with you? If it's at soccer practice, then help them ahead of time talk to their coach and create, some kind of signal that the young person can give to the coach to let them know they're struggling. A professional therapist could absolutely be part of this team. In fact, if on a scale of 1 to 10, your kid's a 6 or above, or really at any time, I highly encourage seeing a mental health professional. And if you don't know a therapist, then you can reach out to a local church, your local school, and try to get some referrals. And then lastly, I would say it's empathize with that young person. Empathize with that young person. Lisa DeMore has a great phrase for us as adults to say to young people, and it's 2 parts. And it's when they're struggling with something, to say, that stinks, and I think you can handle it. That stinks, and I think you can handle it. And there's all sorts of variations on that. Boy, if I had an AP bio test this week, I'd be anxious too. How can I help you with anxiety you might be feeling before your AP test. So, it might be an offer to help. It might be, what options do you think you could pursue if you do feel anxious, if you do feel stressed? But that kind of 1-2 phrase, empathizing, acknowledging the feeling, acknowledge the challenge, and then somehow let your young person know that you think they have a bit of agency and wisdom to move forward.
In my family, we appeal to the universal wisdom found in the Adam Sandler movie Waterboy, which is I'm sure you've all seen it
Sure.
many times, but there is this character whose entire role is he sits there and he says, "You can do it," and there's even a GIF of course, there's a GIF of it. So the GIF is always flooding the timeline. But here's a question that I have. It's always dangerous to try to universalize from personal experience, but let me go ahead and
Let's do that anyway. Yes.
Yeah, let's do it anyway, but fully cognizant of its dangers. So I grew up in a pretty uncertain and troubled time, height of the Cold War. I mean, I still remember when KAL 007 was shot down. Where are we going to go to war? I remember vividly going to school the day after aired on ABC. And sort of this sense of, oh my gosh, that everyone had. So we're growing up in a troubled time, but I don't remember, and my parents did not reflect or dwell on that trouble. They shielded me. If they were nervous about the state of the world, I didn't know it. And I feel like there's a way in which the more friendship-based model of parenting now, I feel like we might be sharing sort of too much of our anxieties and our own concerns with our kids. And, I've become cognizant that I think I do that more than my parents did, and I'm not sure that's great. So since you're a professional, I just thought I'd ask you what you thought about that.
Well, one of my life mantras is that balance is something we swing through on our way to the other extreme. And so, I feel like I'm constantly vacillating from one extreme to another. And I think this is true with how much we disclose as parents about our own anxiety. So I think what I would encourage parents and step-parents, caregivers and guardians to do is ask somebody close to you, hey, do you feel like I'm sharing the right amount of information with my kids? Or do you think I'm oversharing or undersharing? Because I think there's one parenting style that is a little bit more stoic, a little bit more reserved. Certainly different ethnic cultures are part of how we parent too, and some might lean toward more stoicism. And then there are other parenting styles that are, and again, this could be correlated to ethnicity, culture, that are much more open book, and perhaps the child is exposed to more than is healthy. And so I would say, know yourself, but then also you might not have an accurate perspective. And so it's asking a peer, a spouse, a close friend, a roommate, whoever it might be, hey, what do you think about what I'm sharing with my young person? Or I'm thinking about sharing this. What do you think? And getting somebody's additional opinion could be really valuable.
Well, Kara, this connection between the parent's own mental health and mental
Yeah.
state and the kids is a fascinating one for me. I mean, and by the way, I really appreciate how you're calling out some of the cultural differences. I grew up in a Chinese immigrant family. I'm an immigrant myself. I'm in a biracial marriage. And so I struggle with this all the time where I'm parenting in a way that feels completely bizarre to my own experience growing up, which was much more stoic, like you said. And this, talking to my kids about their feelings, it's like, I think it's the right thing, but it just feels completely foreign. And it does point to these are cultural realities that we're navigating, and we're in culturally complex situations in some of them. So just to say, I appreciate that. And I don't think we've got one answer. I mean, even your ABCDE is going to need to get modified for different people's cultural context, right? So, but I do think there's something to that that has been underexplored enough that this rise with teen anxiety is correlated with a rise of adult anxiety, and I don't think there's got to be some correlation to that, and I do especially would love to hear your thoughts on when you are a parent of a anxious teen. How much of that is a signal that you may need to do some work yourself on your own anxiety, that there's something of a mirroring effect going on, or at least that you're going to be anxious about your kids' anxiety, and the more and that's going to be a factor that you've got to actually figure out how to actually get your own anxiety out of the story and dealt with differently such that you're not intertwined with your kids' anxiety. So I'd love your thoughts on that. Yeah.
Well, I think for us as parents and mentors to always ask ourselves about our own health, regardless of what we're seeing in our kids, is important. And I imagine most of your listeners have heard the old metaphor that you put your own oxygen mask on first, and then you put your kids'
Mm.
oxygen mask on. And so, I was just thinking recently about how perhaps, I mean, as a researcher, I rarely say the best, but I think I'm going to go ahead and say it. Uh, I think the best gift I can give as a leader is my own health and wholeness, my own healthy, thriving self. And I think the
Yeah.
same is probably true as a parent. The best gift I can give my family is my healthy, thriving, growing, self-aware self.
Yeah.
So yes, I think I always want us to be growing. In fact, at one point, we at Fuller Seminary for students who are getting their MDiv, which at the time was the most common track for pastors. It's broadened since, but at the time was the most common track. We thought about requiring professional therapy for everybody who is getting an MDiv. And we couldn't figure out a way to operationalize that. But I think that's the spirit that I would want, is that
Right.
that all of us are getting the professional help we need, as well as the community support, spiritual direction, small group, etc. So yes, on the personal health. I think I'll speak more autobiographically. What I'm trying to work on myself as a parent is, and our kids are 16, 19, and 21, is I feel like when I ask a question, my kids know the answer that I'm wanting to hear, and I want them to give the real answer, not the answer they're wanting to hear. So
Oh,
even
yeah.
if it's that I'm wanting to hear. So even if it's something like, "Well, how did you do on the test?" And like, there's a way for me to ask that as a parent that is anxious. Like, "I know you were worried about this. I know you studied. How do you think you did?" That has a lot more emotion behind it versus, "Hey, how did that test go that you were worried about?" Like, do you hear the difference in the amount of pressure that puts on that 13 or 15 or
Right.
17-year-old? And so I think it's me working on my own emotions, and then me thinking about what am I communicating with tone of voice, with the way I look, with how frequently I ask about something. One really great tip I got, and if my kids ever listen to this, they would catch on, and I don't think they have yet, but I probably ask this question a couple times a week to my kid, is instead of saying, "Well, how are you going to get your homework done?" or "What are you going to do about that paper I know you're worried about?" I ask, "What's your plan?" Like, those 3 words are brilliant in parenting adolescents and beyond. "What's your plan?" My son started a new job today as a 21-year-old. And so, I said, "Well, what's your plan for what you're gonna wear?" Because I'm thinking, he does not know what to wear. And what's your plan? It's just 3 great words as a preface that again shows you believe in your young person, you're involved, you're curious, you could help if needed, but you're also thinking that they probably have a start, and you want to start with where they are. So yes, watching our own emotion, how we ask about things. "Oh, did you get invited to the Friday party?" Like that communicates our anxiety about our kids socially versus, "Hey, what are your plans for Friday?" See the difference. So
Yeah. That's great. That's great.
The longer we sort of drag through this era of anxiety, the more I am convinced of, going back and reminding myself and reminding others how much scripture says, fear not, fear not. And, God did not give us a spirit of fear. And, the other day I was speaking at a church, and a parent asked me, so we got a bunch of youth here, and pointed over to youth group. You know how the youth group always sits together, and said, what's your message to get them ready for CRT, for critical race theory? And I just said, my message is fear not, like, don't be afraid of all of that stuff. And And I feel like we have created such a grievance and fear-based political culture for sure, but also a grievance and fear-based culture, period, that almost the last message our kids is getting is fear not. It seems to be much more like fear everything. And, from not making the volleyball team to not doing well on the test or not, and that everything is weighted with sort of your future is at stake kind of stakes.
Although we do have to recognize that they do have, like, I'm thinking about my kids, and they do have, like, substantive reasons to fear for their future existentially. I guess that's similar to our nuclear holocaust fear, which is for them is climate change,
Oh my
right?
gosh. I mean,
I don't know.
yeah.
I mean, so many of my peers, my own kids, like that is an existential fear that they are going to inherit a devastated planet, or an increasingly devastated planet. Kara, is that how widely? I mean, I'm in the Bay Area, so I'm kind of curious. Like, is that a Bay Area thing? How wide does that cut across? Other geographies, across the political spectrum. The sense among our youth.
I'll just say it's not here.
It's not in the.
It's not here. No.
I don't have solid at my fingertips data on the quantity and quality of fears now versus previous cohorts of young people. In California, we have earthquake drills. So when you were talking, and I remember we were supposed to get under our desk in case of a nuclear attack. Also, like getting under your desk was the go-to behavior, regardless of what happened. But you know what? We didn't have shooter drills, and every school now has shooter drills. We did not have a pandemic. And again, as much as I love how much my kids learn about the world through technology and social media, et cetera, they're exposed. Every minute they could hear about another tragedy, another injustice, et cetera. So anecdotally, I think young people are a little bit more afraid right now. Here's what I really want is, I want the church and the family to be a place where we can discuss those fears and where parents and leaders feel okay discussing those fears. In California, Curtis, I'm also in California, and California legislation has passed a bill that every middle school and high school ID, public or private school, on the back is the National Suicide Prevention Hotline. Like every California teenager is literally walking around with the National Suicide Prevention Hotline phone number on the back of their ID, which I think is wonderful. I hope more states do the same. Anything we can do to give kids a resource. But here's the thing. I don't want it to just be a conversation that happens at school, although it should happen at school.
Right.
I also want it to happen around our kitchen tables as we're driving in minivans, as we're tucking kids in our small groups, in our worship environments, et cetera. So, I want church and family to be the first place that young people can go to talk about all their struggles and fears, not the last. And that's the kind of climate we're trying to create at the Fuller Youth Institute.
Well, that's a great segue into this resource that the Fuller Youth Institute has prepared called Faith in an Anxious World. It's meant to be a very accessible curriculum that I want you to tell our listeners more about and help us know how to access this as a way to have these conversations, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you can go to fulleryouthinstitute.org. That's fulleryouthinstitute.org to get all of our resources, including Faith in an Anxious World. And Faith in the Anxious World has two branches. One is a curriculum primarily geared for youth ministries, although some schools, especially Christian schools, have also used it. And that's 4 weeks looking at how do you create the team you need? How do you have the kind of the true messages about faith you need to navigate anxiety. And then there's also a parallel 4-week podcast or 4-session podcast for parents, caregivers, guardians on the same themes. So the idea being that the family and the faith community can both be learning about the same topics at the same time and learning how to respond together.
Well, Kara, that's a great note to end on. So appreciate you joining us. As I said, this is such an important topic because a lot of the things we talk about are things where we're thinking about how to think about something that we can't necessarily impact all that much, to be honest. But here, when we're talking about our own kids and our own household, we're thinking through how do we impact the people that we have the most influence over in all of our lives. And so thank you so much for joining us. We really
My
appreciate
pleasure.
it.
Thank you for caring so much about young people and our world today.
Thanks, Kara.